Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Little, if anything, is ever discussed about the price we who are Jewish pay when we accept Jesus, Yeshua, as our Messiah. Our next guest knows firsthand what the price she paid and how her profession of faith cost her one family for a season, yet brought her a much larger family only God could have created. Added to her 30 years as a breast cancer survivor, she is pure light that has overcome darkness. Lily Isaacs is a founder and member of the Isaacs, who have been sharing their faith for over 35 years. They perform often at the Grand Ole Opry and in the Gaither Homecoming concerts and video series. Individually and as a group, they have won numerous musical awards. Here to share her autobiography, You Don't Cry Out Loud, the Lily Isaacs story, is Lily Isaac. Lily, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you today.
Lily, there's so much to your story, and your story began in Germany. And so
Yes,
maybe we can start there so people can understand this Jewish girl being born in Nazi Germany and the life of a Holocaust surviving family and what your parents and what you went through.
Well, my parents are Polish Jews, and they, along with all their families, went into concentration camps. Of course, when the war started in 1939, there was so much devastation all over Europe, especially in Poland. And they went to the Warsaw ghettos first. Of course, my parents were not married at the time. They were just from the same hometown. So they were in the ghettos first, in the Warsaw ghetto, then eventually wound up in Germany. My father was in one concentration camp. My mother was in another, separated from family. When the war was over in 1945, my mother had lost most of her family. She only had a surviving sister and brother. My father lost all of his family except for one brother. At that time, they called the people that were survivors of the Holocaust displaced persons. So they set up a lot of these relief camps all over Germany to try to, like B'nai B'rith, United Jewish Appeal, Red Cross came in and were very helpful and collected a lot of the survivors that way to nurse them back to health, try to find family members. So my parents wound up in a French Army relief camp in Feldafing, Germany, which is near Munich. That's where they married. That's where they met. That's where they got married and stayed there for a while. I was born in Munich, and they stayed there another couple of years. Of course, at that time, there were a lot of countries that were receiving Holocaust surviving immigrants, but you had to have a sponsor. So my father's only brother that survived went to Australia and called for him to come there. My mother had an uncle that had settled in America, and so that's where they decided to come, was here, the United States. We came over in 1949 on the SS General Hahn, a big ship, and settled in New York City. I grew up in the Bronx, New York. When I was 9 years old, my parents and I went to Ellis Island, and I remember that well. I don't remember coming here. I was too young. I was a baby. But I do remember going to Ellis Island with my parents and becoming American citizens. We were very proud. My father became a bread baker, and my mother and dad went to night classes to learn English. They spoke Yiddish in the home and Polish. So we struggled. We lived in some very poor neighborhoods for a long time to get started, but we worked hard and we were proud to be Americans. So we blended into the beautiful culture. And so that's how I grew up. I grew up in the Bronx. That was kind of our beginning. After we lived here a few years, my brother was born, and there were just two of us. He was born here in America. That was kind of the beginning of the whole thing.
So were you raised in the synagogue, or were
Yes.
they? So they were religious.
Yes.
They, like my grandparents, and I have a cousin that we brought from the displaced persons camp. So similar story. I lost a lot of my family at Babi Yar and in the barracks in Ukraine. My father's family came from Hungary in 1934. 1 year before the communists came. So we have kind of an interesting story background that
Yes.
parallels, and of course raised in the synagogue. You had an encounter, here you were, Holocaust surviving family. according to Dr. Michael Rydelnik, Moody Bible, head of Jewish studies there, one of my professors who's also parents Holocaust survivors, he said there's really two types of Holocaust surviving families. Those who only talk about the Holocaust and those who never talk about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I actually grew up in a family that never spoke about the Holocaust, and only in my grandfather's later years, and he came in 1904 and then went back in World War I to fight because they came out of the shtetls of Western Ukraine, southern Poland. He went back to fight, and his heart was to really share what happened. Then I went to Ukraine and to Budapest and resurrected the whole family story so that I would have a real understanding of who, what, where, when. Never, of course, understanding why, except from a biblical perspective. So here you were raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, in an observant community, observant neighbor, surrounded by Yiddish-speaking. How was your Yiddish?
My Yiddish was good because my parents also spoke Polish, but they only spoke Polish when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. So, but Yiddish was spoken in our home. I learned more English when I started kindergarten, and my parents went to night classes to learn English. They were very determined to blend in, so we did speak some English, but you have to practice it. So, of course, when I left home, got married, my Yiddish is pretty broken, but I still understand it well. Yeah, so my parents spoke about the Holocaust only on occasion. We had to pry it out of them. And when my children were teenagers, I got way more out of my parents than I did when I was young. But when you grow up in that environment, you don't think to ask questions. It's like, it's just the way life is, and you don't ask why or what. It's just an underlying knowledge, and that was it. So I wish I would have asked more questions. I wish I would have dug into more. But again, when my kids became teenagers, that's when they started asking a lot more questions, and they opened up little bits and pieces here and there. And especially my mother's later years in her life, she told a lot more.
Well, something happened in your in your life in 1971 that changed you forever. It also cost you something very, very dear, and a price that you had to pay that the world is very unaware of. When you and I made the decision to accept Jesus as our Messiah, we literally had to make the decision that we knew that we could possibly lose 14,700,000 relatives.
That's right.
Okay.
Amen.
The average Christian loses nothing, gains everything. The average Jew, and I accepted the Lord at age 44, I had to be willing to count the cost, and the cost would be that my parents, my family, would disassociate from me. I was fortunate that a part of the family did, but not all of the family did, and so there was still some relationship there. But for you, that was not the case. So you're coming to faith in 1971. How did that happen? And when you shared with your family what happened, what was the consequence?
Well, I married a young man from Kentucky. I was in show business, and I was in the hippie movement in New York City. Had an album out on Columbia Records, so we did a bunch of nightclubs. And there was a bluegrass band traveled to New York from Kentucky that I had met my husband. He was a banjo player. He was a cowboy. His last name was Isaacs, so I thought he was Jewish, and he didn't tell me differently till we fell in love. And so I thought, I'd never dated non-Jews, but we did get married in 1970. He is the baby child of 17 children whose father was a Pentecostal preacher. And so our backgrounds could not be any more different. But I gave up my life in New York. We moved to Ohio, where his work was. And a few months after our marriage, it took a while for my parents to accept him because he wasn't Jewish. And of course, their dream was for me to marry a Jewish boy. But he was friendly and charismatic, and, he'd fix anything. So they kind of, accepted him. They thought that I would proselyte him to Judaism, basically, is what it was. But after we married about a year, he had a brother that got killed in a car accident. He was 27 years old, 4 small children. Our home was traumatic. So it was the first funeral I had been to in my whole life. It was in a church. We went in there that day, and I was afraid. I mean, I just knew that wasn't my style. I don't go to church. I didn't do anything like that. But I went with the family because I knew I'd have to. And I saw a community of believers there that I'd never seen before. The church was full, people were loving, they were caring, there was a lot of grief, but on the other hand, everybody's so warm and friendly, and it was just a different feeling to me. And my husband's family always treated me really well, but I never got into the religious part of it. You know, I never did care about knowing about all that stuff. And he wasn't a churchgoer at the time either, even though he was raised in a Christian home. But after the funeral was over, the family decided to meet one night in the church where my brother-in-law had attended. We went that night. I didn't want to go, but I went because of the family. And that night, in the very last pew, I felt like I needed to put a coat over my head because I was ashamed of it. Being there, I felt something in my heart. I felt that void, and I saw the love. I saw it was just different for me, a community of people that were together on things. So without even knowing, the pastor got up, made an invitation. I didn't get out of my seat, but somehow I fell down at my pew in the very bit, at the end of the row in the last seat. And I just cried. I didn't know what to say, but I cried. And I think, the minute my knees hit the floor, the Lord already knew my heart. So that was the beginning to me. And after that experience, I started reading the New Testament. I'd never read it before. I learned that Jesus was a Jew just like me. Didn't know that. And it was like the beginning of an exciting era for me. And I started going to church more and learning, and I was excited. And I know that God was teaching me. And my husband at the time was not a Christian before then, so we did the journey together. But I had not planned on telling my parents until I was really grounded in what I was doing. But I had a cousin come visit me from New York. And of course, I had to take him to church with me because I was so excited about what I was doing. So he went with us. And the minute he got back to New York, he told my parents, he told his parents that I'd fallen off the deep end, that I belonged to a cult believing in Jesus. It was just so without knowing. My parents called me on my job one day, and they told me that they heard about it, and they said, we heard about this Jesus stuff. We didn't raise you that way. You're the black sheep of the family, and if you're not going to give up this junk, we don't ever want to see you again. Don't ever come home again. And I was sitting at my desk on my job crying. It was not what I planned. I didn't plan on it happening that way. I wanted to sit down with them and have a legible conversation and explain. It didn't happen that way. And it tore my heart out of me. I thought all the years that I tried to be a blessing to my parents who lost so much, all of a sudden I was a black sheep of the family. All of a sudden they didn't want to see me anymore. And it was hard. It was really hard. And I don't know how I did it, but I just said, I love you guys. I love you, Mom and Dad, but I can't give up what I found. And it was months before they'd speak to me, months. I'd call home, they'd hang up on me. Did you quit going to church? No. But you know what? It taught me when I did go to church that Yeshua became my father. He became my mother. He became my brother, my sister, my all. And I had a little trouble praying before then. Even when I go to the altar, I'd say God. I could say Messiah. But when I come to say the name of Jesus, it's almost like I could see my parents pointing a finger at me, saying, oh, But through that trial is when I really, really, really found Yeshua as my Messiah. And it took the birth of my son about a year after that to have my parents get softer about accepting me back home. And it was always a touchy subject all of our lives, especially becoming a ministry and traveling and singing. And all of my adult life, it was a little bit testy for me. But through the end of their lives, things got a little bit easier with them. But I had to make a conscious choice not to let my salvation get in the way of our relationship because I didn't want to lose them again. And I didn't actually lose them. I know it was just a trick of the enemy to try to get me to change, but I'm so grateful that I did continue my walk with the Lord. It's been 40 years now, and I'm grateful for that.
During that same season, you are a 30-year breast cancer survivor, and you went through this very difficult trial where your faith was being tested because you had already stepped out in faith. The Isaacs had been formed. You were now performing for the Lord. You were now making a name for yourself in the Christian music circle, and here this massive physical attack comes upon you. What did you find, and why did you entitle the book "You Don't Cry Out Loud"?
Well, I was a young mother of 3 small children, and when I found the knot, I had just gone through back surgery 6 weeks before then. So I was so traumatized. And, that many years ago, breast cancer wasn't even talked about like it was. I knew I was going to die, and I didn't, oh my goodness. So anyway, but I got through it. God gave me strength. I had surgery. Things were well. I moved on with my life. And it's been a tool for me to talk to many women that have undergone breast cancer surgery. My daughter wrote a beautiful song. My daughter and son-in-law several years ago that Martina McBride recorded in country music, made a #1 hit called "I'm Gonna Love You Through It." It's reached millions of people, and it was based on my story. So I know God used that experience to do something. They've raised millions of dollars for breast cancer awareness through this organization they started. So, all in all, the reason I called my book "You Don't Cry Out Loud" is when we were reviewing the book, my ghostwriter, Sean Smucker, who's my friend, in fact, I'm writing another book currently, we were reviewing it, and I didn't know what to call my book. But that's a statement my mother made, because one of my daughters had asked her, "Grandma, what did you do when you were in the camps? How could you cope with all that abuse and starvation and seeing all that around you?" And her exact words were, "Oh, we cried a lot, but we didn't cry out loud." And I said, that has to be the title of my book. Many of us go through those situations in life when deep down in our hearts and our spirit we're crying, but somehow you muster enough strength and you hold it in, which may not be a good thing, but a lot of people don't cry out loud.
It's interesting. We have Sean coming on the program next week.
Yes.
And we'll be spending an hour with him talking about his book, Once We Were Strangers, about his relationship with his new Syrian refugee friends. So it's
awesome.
Nice to have that connection with Sean through you as well. Your identity as a Christian musician, how often are you able to talk about your Jewish roots? How often does it come into play? And do you find yourself drawn to what Paul said in Romans 1:16, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to all who believe, but to the Jew first, and then to the Greek." Has there been anything in you that's caused you to want to draw closer to the Jewish community or to Israel or to any of that, because you have such a deep connection, such a deep root? And we need the face, we need the name to bring it to light that it was first century Judaism is what the Bible is all about. It's not about first century Christianity. And it's been hijacked, and our identity has been hijacked. Our Messiah has been hijacked, and that it's been distorted to the point where up until the 70s, you and I were blamed for killing Jesus.
Right.
I had such a complex as a child that when Kennedy got shot and people began to ask the question years later, where were you when Kennedy got shot? I would ask, what, am I a suspect? Because I was called a Christ killer. And so here I'd already been blamed for one murder, now I'm being blamed for another. And I carried that kind of chip on my shoulder that we had been blamed for being the ones who killed Jesus, when of course the Bible does not say that, confirm that, or even imply that. So here you are, a voice, the Isaacs, well-known, fabulous family entity, an icon in the Christian world. But do you see this as this being a part of your voice to be able to share a story that you're still Jewish? You did not stop being Jewish. You did not convert to Christianity. You became a Jewish believer in the Jewish Messiah. And we have to hold on to that, or we'll lose our identity. And the finger pointed at us is that we're committed to spiritual holocaust. And the truth of the matter is we're not. that this was the belief system of the Jews. Many of the Jews, millions of Jewish people accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and it is part of God's plan for the return of Jesus. We bear that burden in Matthew 23:37 through 39, that it's going to be Jerusalem that calls for the return of Jesus. Is that playing any part in your new story as you continue to grow and your voice continues to grow? Is this becoming more a part of the message of You Don't Cry Out Loud, but also giving it that the little bit more schmaltzy side of the Jewish push?
Yes. Well, I make a conscious choice to speak about it every night. I don't care where we are. I tell my story everywhere we go.
Wonderful.
And my children being Jewish as well, we're known as a Jewish community of believers, and we're very involved with the Messianic movement. We have friends and prayer partners that are pretty influential. The Messiah Conference
Yes.
that takes place annually. We were there last year. We're going back again next year. We're really good friends with some of the Messianic rabbis in that movement. We take pride in saying that we're Messianic believers everywhere we go. I'm not shy about it. I read something out of my book every night when we go, which is the reason I had written my book, because I had a lot of requests for it. We're very much proactive in claiming that Yeshua is for all people, the Jew first, then the Greek and Gentile. And we do that in all of our shows because we feel like God's put us on a platform for a reason. And yes, we're very much committed to spreading the good news that way. And I see a lot of Messianic believers out there in corners of the world that I wouldn't even believe. And it is way more prominent now than I ever thought it would be.
Lily, you have been a blessing, and I know that our time is short, but the name of the book is You Don't Cry Out Loud, the Lily Isaacs story. The book can be downloaded and read in Apple Books. It's available everywhere. You can follow their music. And Lily Isaacs, it has been a blessing, a machaya, to be with you, and I thank you so much for taking the time out of a very, very busy schedule to spend this half hour with us. God bless you.
Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.